This is Joe Kwan of the Avett Brothers, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. Of these, the largest and most controversial ones are huge concrete buildings that are imposing, often inefficient and expensive to change. Their design has come to be called brutalist, and like sushi and NASCAR, you either love them or you don't. Joining us is author Owen Hopkins and his new book, The Brutalists, a portrait of 250 of the most influential examples of large-scale modernist architecture. Later on, we'll welcome some architects from Raleigh, North Carolina, who are also musicians, Poinsettia. And now, our brutalist fan, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. I mean, of course, I'm going to be a fan of big, modern concrete buildings. But I will give the critics, like past podcast guests Justin Shubo, Catesby Lee, and J.S. Curl, a few nods. Like every building style, some brutalist buildings have problems. We can argue aesthetics, which Justin and Catesby and J.S. do incessantly, but let's talk function. One of the greatest advantages of concrete is that you can go tall, you can go big, and you can make very interesting shapes. But all that concrete is heavy, and you have to support it, which means that the interiors are huge and heavy. Functions in buildings do adapt over time, and it's nearly impossible to make significant changes when you're dealing with tons of concrete. Further, these buildings are often custom built for a particular client. However, if there's too much distance between the architect and the rank-and-file building users, it generally results in a rabbit warren of hallways and rooms that just don't make sense. The FBI building in Washington is a great example. Lovely on the outside and a pain in the ass on the inside. What happens most frequently is when a gorgeous, wonderfully functional modernist building built for, say, an insurance company is sold to a city for, drumroll please, a police headquarters. This happened both in Raleigh and Durham, North Carolina. No surprise, the police forces hated these buildings, which were never made for police operations. Those insurance buildings should have been sold to another general office-type firm, say one that sells paper products. Dunder Mifflin, for example.
Yes.
God, I miss that show.
Me too.
U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Architectural historian Owen Hopkins has written or edited 16 books on architecture and writes articles on everything from 18th century architecture to postmodernism. His stories have appeared in Architectural Design, Dezeen, The Independent, and Blueprint, among many others. A graduate of the Courtauld Institute in London, Owen has served as Architectural Program Curator at the Royal Academy of Arts, Senior Curator at Sir John Soane's Museum, and now is the Director of Newcastle University's new Farrell Centre, an institution devoted to architecture and cities. During the pandemic, he hosted the podcast 20 by 20, and his latest book is about brutalism, those large concrete buildings many people love, and King Charles and critic Roger Scruton hate. Did I mention hate? As the book points out, brutalist architecture inspires a passionate response, be it adulation or contempt. And there's a lot of both to go around. Welcome to U.S. Modernist, Owen.
Thanks for having me.
So, Owen, years ago, decades ago, when I first heard the term brutalist buildings, I immediately thought of prisons, which many buildings have been compared to. So, what defines a brutalist building to start off with?
Well, it's the fundamental question that the book tackles in many ways. I mean, very simply, the thing that most frequently defines brutalist buildings is the fact that they are constructed from raw concrete that is used often in highly sculptural ways. But if you drill down a little bit further, the brutalist buildings don't necessarily have to be in concrete. It's more about a kind of truth to materials, a kind of sense of leaving buildings, leaving materials as found, in a sense. And more recently, that sculptural side of brutalism has really become its most defining feature.
And how did brutalism get started as a style? And who started calling it that?
Yeah, what an awful name.
Yeah.
Sounds like you're being beat up.
Yes, I mean, it suffered because of the name, actually.
Mm-hmm.
The name itself isn't anything to do with being brutal, although sometimes the buildings are, and it's very much a gift for the style's detractors. But it derives from the French béton brut, which literally means raw concrete.
Really?
And it seemed to originate in the architecture, the post-war architecture of Le Corbusier, particularly his Unité d'Habitation in Marseille, this very rugged sort of ocean liner of a block with rectilinear geometry and these highly sculptural pilotti that raise it up. But brutalism as a style or as a movement really arose first in England, where it was called the New Brutalism. And it was associated with a group of architects, but also artists and writers who were interested in a kind of second generation of modernism, a kind of doubling down on its radical early energy. And were also highly influenced and were themselves influential in the emergence of pop art. So it has this kind of dual thing of being part of this re-radicalization of modernism, but also interested in popular culture. And also at that time in England, and particularly London, where it kind of grew up in a sense, the experience of the bombed city and of wandering through parts of London that had been decimated during the Second World War, and that almost visceral experience of architecture sort of deconstructed and of materials broken apart and fragmented, all kind of fed into this melting pot from which emerged what we understand now as brutalism.
Were there brutalist buildings in London that were erected before the Second World War and destroyed by German bombs?
No, it was more the experience of the bombed-out city.
A response, in a way?
Yeah, and this kind of sort of visceral experience in the sense of sites reduced to rubble. It was a kind of feeling for materials in their kind of barest, stripped-back forms that kind of fed into, particularly in the work of Alison and Peter Smithson, who were kind of highly influential in the emergence of brutalism, or New Brutalism as it was called in England, of really kind of stripping things back to their bare essentials. And that found form in their work, ironically, given its very close association with concrete. The Smithson's first notable brutalist work was actually in steel and glass, as a school in Norfolk, but it exhibited exactly the same characteristics that found form in the buildings that we now so typically associate with brutalism that were predominantly of concrete.
I didn't know that brutalism really originated in the UK, and there's a particularly famous fan of brutalism that you reference in the book. Her quote is, "I love architecture of all kinds, but I love brutalist deeply, because it's not soft or easy to understand. Some people think it's ugly, but I appreciate the strength, the juxtaposition of minimalist lines with complex, sometimes cubic structures." Who do you think that is, Tom?
The Queen?
Nope. Try again.
You got me. Margaret Thatcher?
Gwyneth Paltrow.
Huh?
Who actually lived in the UK for a couple of years with her parents, Bruce Paltrow and Blythe Danner.
Oh.
What do you know?
I guess she's a fan.
And that's in the book.
It is in the book.
Did you get to meet Gwyneth, Owen?
No, that was posted on Instagram, and it was reposted by various people on Twitter, and it seemed to me a kind of quite a nice place to start with the introduction that was setting up, as you alluded to in your introduction, is kind of one of the paradoxes about brutalism, which is the way that it completely polarizes opinion. People absolutely despise it, or they love it.
Yeah, well, it's quite an eloquent expression, and I get it.
Your book is called The Brutalist, Brutalism's Best Architects. What inspired you to take this on?
Well, it was a curiosity with brutalism, which I'd sort of explored in some previous projects. A previous book, actually, a much smaller book that was focused on Britain called Lost Futures, which looked at post-war buildings that had been demolished or substantially altered and tried to kind of piece together why that was and kind of get between a lot of the kind of received debate around them that sees these buildings in terms of failure or that they had been unsuccessful. And I was interested in the actual reasons why these buildings had started to disappear. And so many of them were brutalist. And there was this really interesting thing about how brutalism had become a kind of site of political contest, in a sense, between the sort of, to some extent, reactionary right, for whom this was seen as the architecture of the welfare state and the values that they were seeking to kind of overturn in favor of a kind of cult of individualism in the 70s and 80s, but still holds tremendous sway today. And then a kind of revisionist turn, particularly on the political left, that sort of held so many of these buildings up as sort of paragons of enlightened social democratic values. I mean, it's one of the features of brutalism is that so much of it across the world actually is social housing or public housing. And I was interested to kind of get between these two opinions with that book, and it kind of doing it actually left more questions than answers in a funny way. And I was struck by the way brutalism seems to evade these characterizations. Yes, so much of it is social housing, but in this book, there are many examples of buildings that actually aren't really associated with welfare state or even socialist principles. There's commercial architecture, there's ecclesiastical architecture, there's all number of different examples. And of course, from the perspective of the reactionary right, who hate this stuff and for whom it is a kind of very easy punching bag, the realities of so many of these buildings just don't fit this just being written off as failure or of evidence of architects or of planners' hubris. So it was simply, the fact that this stuff had provoked even more questions the more I kind of looked at it previously.
Are brutalist buildings being designed and built today, or is it more of a style of the recent past?
Yeah, it's a tricky question in a sense. I mean, the book principally focuses on the little bit 50s, mostly 60s and 70s. There are some examples of buildings and architects working today who could be described as brutalists, but it tends to be in a different sense to those, kind of the majority of those in the book. It could be, you can readily make a case for Grafton architects, who are based in Dublin, who won the Pritzker Prize a couple of years ago, who work in a sort of sculptural concrete idiom for being brutalists. I suspect they would resist the description. There's another project in the book by the Portuguese architect, Eduardo Souto de Moura, and, that similarly could qualify as brutalist, or Studio Fuxas, for example. But there does seem to be, to some extent, a dividing line in terms of the contexts around this stuff and the context that, to some extent, drove it. But I think what the book was, by bringing these, at times, quite disparate figures together, there was a sense of a group of architects who were interested in architecture at perhaps its most fundamental, architecture that is stripped back to the kind of bare essentials of material, of form, geometry, of kind of sculptural mass. And I think that probably reflects a trend which is universal, kind of appears at different moments of history with different intensities, but is always there. Manifests more strongly at different moments, manifest particularly strongly in the 1960s and 70s, maybe less so today, but perhaps will come back maybe in a different guise, maybe not necessarily in raw concrete, but will come back in the future.
One of the things I really like about the book, Owen, is your decision to have all the photos in black and white. Why did you do that?
Well, I've been asked this before, actually, and this was a decision made by the publisher, actually. I mean, I was happy to go along with it. It kind of felt that it gave a kind of unity to the, at times, quite disparate examples in the book, and therefore was useful to my argument in a sense that all of these architects brought together were brutalists, even if the work of some might evade the descriptor or others who are still around might actively evade it similarly. It's an interesting thing because it does bring all this stuff together, makes it stand together as a kind of coherent mass of architecture.
Yeah, as a form without all that distracting color.
Yeah, the color introduces the kind of the contingent in a sense, and maybe complexifies the situation a little bit more. But I think for the purposes of this book, and it worked very well, and obviously from an aesthetic point of view, brutalism has this other life. They're the buildings themselves, and then there's the brutalism that exists in the world of images, online, on Instagram, on Twitter, on blogs, which is to some extent what drove it, the revival of interest in it. I mean, it's very much a phenomenon of the last 15 years, I'd say, at the most, maybe even the last decade. And it's interesting that the ability of brutalist buildings to be made into images, to be made into seductive, powerful, dramatic images has kind of found the perfect outlet in the world of social media.
One of the buildings I wanted to find out more about from you was designed by Igor Vasilevsky. It's a sanatorium in Yalta in the Ukraine, which is very topical right now. Is that building still in use? Has it been abandoned? Has it been destroyed? What's the story? Do you know?
I believe it's hasn't been destroyed. Whether it's still in use, I couldn't say. I mean, it's a building that's become familiar to Western audience through this revival of interest in brutalism. I mean, it's interesting that I think it's probably very little visited.
So Owen is now typing it into his computer, as your listeners should be doing too. It's the Igor Vasilevsky Druzhba Sanatorium, spelled Druzhba.
I'm checking it
in the Ukraine.
Yeah, well, I'm checking. What I wanted to do was to check the photographer, the name of the photographer. I'm very bad with names. And it's a really iconic image. The photographer is Frédéric Chaubin, who did a really popular book a few years ago now of mostly brutalist buildings in the former Soviet world. And we were very fortunate to use the photograph that's on the cover of his book, which is interestingly in color in that version, but we show it in black and white. And the building is just the most extraordinary thing. The way it kind of just emerges almost spaceship like from the sort of wall of trees. And I think the beauty of that photograph is that it has this very sort of 1970s feel to it, the sort of 1970s futurist feel. But then in the foreground on the beach is a scene of very much the contemporary world. So it's a very powerful and quite arresting image that we were very fortunate that Frédéric Chaubin allowed us to use for this book.
What are some of the reasons why people dislike these buildings, Owen?
Well, I've alluded to some of it already. It became a kind of very obvious target as the political winds changed in the UK, in the US, across the Western world, with the rise of, in the UK, Thatcherism, of sort of the politics of Ronald Reagan in the US, that shift to this kind of new cult of individualism that we still exist in, and the sort of associated political and economic policies. The architecture of the previous era became a very useful target with which to kind of beat up the politics and the ideals that drove that moment. As I mentioned previously, so much brutalist architecture is social housing that has a I think it's fair to say a kind of mixed track record, that it sort of elevated the living conditions of literally millions of people across the world, but perhaps never lived up to the sometimes utopian aspirations of its creators, nor could it ever do that. But at the same time, it wasn't the failure that its detractors often like to describe it. So it became a target, and a really useful one. And you can tell if certainly in the UK, I imagine it's probably a similar thing in the US. If a politician has run out of ideas or wants to kind of pivot to kind of safe political ground, then you can have a go at social housing or public housing and say how terrible it is and how it should be knocked down and how this is something we'd want to draw a line under. It's kind of such a kind of cliche now, but it seems to still work in a sense. So it is politically motivated, I think, so much of the reaction against brutalism, and that's become really ingrained. And one of the things about the revival, I think, that is so interesting is that it's really been driven by a younger group, youngish now, probably some of them getting into their 40s, but a generation
of people that were born after some of these buildings were built.
Yes.
Yeah. And who didn't even live through the backlash against them. So kind of weren't indoctrinated against this architecture, and actually were able to see it once again with fresh eyes, or be able to value it on its own terms, and actually were able to see in it a kind of alternative to what is still presented as the kind of the orthodoxy, or almost kind of the only option politically, economically, that defines the present. These are buildings that are evidence that things that have not always been that way, and things that are being lost in terms of welfare provision, in terms of readily available, affordable housing, can actually be won back again. And similarly, from the other side, for those who want to consign that moment to history, it's useful to have a target to attack, and brutalism has played that role.
Oh, and in the United States, it seems like much of the criticism is aimed here against office buildings, brutalist structures holding U.S. federal agencies, often cities built brutalist buildings in the 50s and 60s, and now these buildings are almost uniformly hated by the people who have to work in them. Did you find that was a trend?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because in the US particularly, there is, in the 60s and 70s particularly, there is quite this is a broad brush characterization, but it's one that is backed up by the evidence. There's quite a strong distinction between commercial, private sector architecture, office buildings, towers that are built in the so-called international style and a kind of Mies van der Rohe inspired language of steel and glass. And then you have public buildings, whether those are libraries, universities, municipal buildings, that tend to be brutalist. And it seemed that these were two architectural languages that, had moments of intersection and overlap, but existed for kind of manifestations of private enterprise and those of the state or the government. But of course, as you say, that many of those government buildings were essentially office buildings. And so there is a little bit of an overlap between them. Why are they disliked by the people who use them? Well, I'm sure they've got valid reasons. I mean, maybe a lot of these buildings weren't or aren't particularly comfortable, and in terms of the inefficiencies in mechanical heating or cooling or ventilation. And that is a big problem for architecture of this
There's
period.
a lot of reasons to hate a building other than the way it looks.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah, and you can hate it for how it feels, for the symbolism of it, for how it works or doesn't work. You can take your pick. It's also one of these things that if there's a group of people who kind of feel one way or another, it's easier to join the herd, I think, very often. And I think that's the case with brutalism. It's a kind of a given for many people that this is bad architecture and we should be despising it.
But for non-office buildings, most of these are very inspiring structures, particularly the churches, some of the schools, the museums, the galleries are just really jaw-dropping when you go inside.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's one of these things that, brutalism is easy to write off, but when you start to look at it in detail, as the book does to some extent. I mean, each building has at least one photograph, and there's a little biography or description of the architect. Once you begin to look at the stories, the ideas that drove them, and then look at what they actually built, then suddenly you see that there is an extraordinary variety in what we describe as brutalist, and an amazing quality as well. Yes, there are not very good buildings, there are bad buildings, there are mediocre buildings, as there are of any style at any moment. Maybe most buildings are generally quite mediocre, and it's actually the exception that buildings are really good, that really stand the test of time. And once you kind of go beyond the surface of brutalism, or kind of look beyond the obvious buildings, then you see that there's just such richness there, and such variety, and so many reasons to be really inspired by this stuff.
The book is The Brutalist, Brutalism's Best Architects, and it's great. If you love concrete, if you've ever stopped your car in front of a sculpturally shaped concrete building, this is the book you want to get. I can remember one time I was traveling with some friends in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, which is not a big town, and we're driving down this street, and I saw this building, and I actually made them stop the car and let me out. And that was the Tower of History, which is a 210-foot observation tower in downtown Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, on Portage Avenue. It was opened in 1968 by George Rafferty, who was the architect, and is still there. It's just fantastic. If you ever visit Sault Ste. Marie, one of my favorite modernist brutalist buildings. Thanks so much for joining us, Owen.
Thanks for having me.
That was our conversation with Owen Hopkins. Vince Whitehurst and Matt Griffith are architects in our hometown of Raleigh, North Carolina. They are both graduates of the master's program in architecture at NC State, and they are both founding principals of their own architecture firms. Vince branched out to designing furniture, housewares, and artworks available at his online site, pedestrianmade.com. He also owns a bar. Matt was a visiting assistant professor at the University of Arkansas before becoming an assistant professor in architecture at NC State. His firm, In Situ Studio, hosts the wildly popular Real Matter lecture series each summer in Raleigh. Vince and Matt are two-thirds of the indie rock group Poinsettia, whose latest album, released in 2020, is Robots. The other third is Finley Lee. Hi, Finley.
Howdy.
Who is not connected to architecture at all.
No, I know these guys.
You're in the software game, right?
That's correct.
And what kind of software do you work on?
It's photography software.
Okay.
So you can take our software and use it to organize your images, or do basic editing, or even applying special effects like film looks.
Can you do deep fakes with it?
Not yet.
Not yet? Or detect them? I want to know how to detect them.
Me too.
Yeah, that's coming down the pike. So guys, how did the band come together?
That's a good question. Maybe Matt. Matt came back to town, right? Is this kind of how it goes? Tell it.
Yeah, I moved back from Arkansas in 2006 and was driving around town, and was driving by Vince's house and saw him out in the yard working on something like he always is. And went up and said hey, and we kind of reconnected, and that led to getting an invite to somebody's birthday party at your house. Can't remember. And we were hanging out afterwards, and I learned that he had a drum set in the basement. And I had been a kind of lapsed drummer for many years, and Vince had been noodling away at the guitar, which was at that time a relatively new instrument to him. And we decided, well, okay, maybe not, sorry. And we decided we'd start just playing music because I wanted to get better at the drums again, and he was kind of working on some stuff with the guitar, and that's where it started. And then we were fortunate to connect with Finley. Vince and Finley had known each other for a long time. Y'all are probably better telling that part of the story. As the bass player, as the third member of the band, and definitely the best musician in the band, in my opinion, is Finley. So we were glad to connect with him.
You need a ringer.
Are you a power trio?
We were definitely a power trio.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. Yeah. That'd be fair.
Yeah. So that's kind of the story. And Vince and I had known each other from grad school. We had overlapped 1 year, or actually I think just one semester.
Yeah, one semester
in grad school back in the
98,
late 90s.
98, something like that. Yeah. And then Finley, actually I knew Finley way back because we both went to undergraduate at Clemson University. So I knew Finley.
Go Tigers.
Yep.
Go Tigers.
Knew him from there, and actually lived with him after school in Columbia, South Carolina for a while. We had an apartment together. But we never played music then, but we did, I think once you were in Raleigh, and then eventually I ended up in Raleigh for grad school, and then we played in a little outfit together called The Lids.
The Lids.
But I played drums in that, not guitar. But I had always done some solo kind of singer-songwriter guitar work and played actually some shows doing that. Then it had been just writing some stuff. And then when me and Matt got together, I'd definitely been thinking, I want to get a band started. I want to get an electric kind of band started. And then me and Matt just started it.
The timing was great because I didn't have a project at the time, and I was kind of looking around saying, what can I do? How can I keep playing some music?
Yeah.
And Vince called me up, and it's like, that's perfect.
So, Matt, how is Vince as a drummer?
Oh, he's really good. I mean, so the thing for me is my drumming history goes back to marching band, and then I stopped playing when I was probably 20 and had barely learned how to play a drum set and didn't pick it up again until we started this however many years ago now. So both Finley and Vince were really patient with me at first because it's taken me a while to come online. And I would say definitely at the beginning, Vince was a much better drummer than I am.
Yeah.
So the pressure was on. I think I've kind of come up to speed a bit now, certainly with the songs we play together. So.
Yeah.
Vince, tell us about this first song, Hollywood Eyes.
So Hollywood Eyes is kind of, it's got a few different things going on. One of it is just by the name Hollywood Eyes. It's somebody who has Hollywood eyes, and they're going to be moving.
There's like Betty Davis eyes?
Maybe, kind of. Somebody whose aspirations are a little different than the normal. And it's also a little bit, got a few little jabs in there and kind of critique of the current state of, quote, college sports. This is even prior to the, what is it now, where they pay all the athletes in college? But this was prior
NIL?
This is prior to that, where it was already a joke. Like, I didn't even like associating myself with Clemson because people thought Clemson's a football team, and they think everything regarding the ACC is all about sports. So there's a little bit of that in there too. But Hollywood Eyes is more about this personal story of somebody who's just like, okay, I don't care about the sports stuff, these teams and these. I need to go somewhere where I'm going to have bigger aspirations to be an actress or whatever.
Here's Poinsettia with Hollywood Eyes.
losers are applying for the pickup game.
It's sort of dark.
Yeah. Some dark kind of chords, I guess, right?
It's all right.
Yeah.
It sets the mood, right? You're
Yeah.
kind of getting a vibe together.
Oh, yeah. That's it. That's the story of that one.
Where'd you guys record that?
Mostly in my basement. And
The original basement band.
yeah, but it's
there's
like,
a few.
It's kind of sound treated decently. Nothing like this, of course, but and then we did overdubs. Like Finley did all the bass, I think, direct at his house.
Did I do that at home?
I think you
couldn't remember.
did. And then me and Matt recorded the drums first, and to isolate those, we did it. I played guitar through the headphones, and he had the headphones on, then edited the drums a little bit, then added the guitar, and then Finley put the bass down, and then last I recorded vocals. So it's like a multi,
You sound like guys who recorded it yourself because you're pretty far into the weeds now.
Yeah.
yeah.
But it sounds professional.
Yeah, it does sound great.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's a lot of time. It's a lot of time that goes into it.
Now, I know what it takes to run an architectural office. So how do you guys find time to do this in addition to running your businesses and recording the albums? And you also play some venues around college campuses. How do you work it in?
Well, believe it or not, we still practice pretty much once a week. And we've kind of kept doing that. That's what keeps us going. We don't have a lot of live shows. We'd love to play some live shows. It's hard. And maybe for me, it's just because as older dudes, you're like interfacing with like a 22-year-old at most of the clubs, and it's just a little weird. I don't know. They're like, "Who's this dude? We're not gonna. These guys aren't playing in our club."
Yeah.
But we're ready to get back at it. We played the Cave. We played Neptunes. We played Slims. Played
Deep South back when it
Deep
existed.
South. We played Poorhouse a few times. We've definitely played around town. Chapel Hill, Raleigh.
Local 506.
Played Cat's Cradle once. Post-COVID, it's been a little hard. And I think it's a venue thing, too. A lot of venues are just now kind of getting back online and booking nightly shows, whereas it's been a long time.
I think the key thing is just regular practice.
It's just keeping it regular. If you just if
you
you
can
keep,
plan around it that way.
keep something on your calendar every week, and then you just do it, and it's part of what you do.
Does playing music help you as an architect?
Sure.
Okay.
Right?
I think so.
How can it hurt?
Software?
How can it hurt?
To me, it balances out.
Yeah.
Because you have this very technical, businessy job on one side, and then it's good to have a creative outlet. I like playing music, and I cook too, and so I think it's just good to have things that sort of balance out the styles of what you do.
Yeah.
I think that's the most important thing for me about music is it is a really nice outlet. We're not in it to make a living, so it's a pretty low stakes enterprise. I mean, we're all pretty passionate about music, and we care that it turns out well. Mm-hmm. But it's mainly just a release from the week and a way to get together and hang out and do something creative. And I think it's a well recorded phenomenon that people, when they're playing music, are about as happy as people get. And so I would encourage anybody out there, even if you've never played an instrument in your life, pick it up. It's a wonderful way to take a break and do something different.
Vince, tell us about this next song, Break Me.
So Break Me is, of course, be a relationship song where you've gotten your heart broken or whatever you want to call it, but then you kind of want to do it again. You want to get broken again by that same person because you want back at that person again. You really want them. And so that's what Break Me is about is give me a second chance and just break me again. That's okay.
That's a good song.
That is a good song.
Yeah, thank you.
And this is one of your fan favorites, right?
Fan favorite of the fans you can count on your hand, but more impressively though, the fans that we don't know, because that's the one like on your Spotify listens and your Shazam request or whatever.
Oh, I mean where people point their phone at the speaker?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the one we'll get. Like, it'll be like somebody's curious. They're like, who's this? Who's this? That's the one. So if any of our songs, I think that's the one that gets hits from people, not our fans, people that, but where maybe they just heard it and they were interested and they wanted to know.
So that's your hit single.
That's a hit single.
That's her hit single.
Yeah.
With a bullet.
But, it's interesting, though, because I would say it's characteristic of our music, but most of our music is probably a little more upbeat and a little more aggressive, maybe.
Yeah.
I'm gonna call out something that you do well as a songwriter, Vince, and that is to write songs that sound different.
Yeah.
And I think maybe more than some of the other bands that I've been in, you tend to write songs that don't sound the same, which I appreciate.
Yeah.
And so I think we've got a pretty wide array of fast and slow.
And I think the song structure is also there's no preconceived idea of what the structure of a song is, which has always been interesting to me. Playing with you guys is there. We have some songs where there's just a long build before we even get to any lyrics. Right?
Yeah.
So the kind of chorus, verse, bridge, verse.
Yeah. I don't really know how that happens, is because a lot of times they're written when I just pick up the guitar and I start strumming, and it's very much a hands-on approach to music where it's just wherever my hands go on the guitar and what sounds come out, and then stringing some things together. And
so the songs tend to come out all at once?
I would say the parts of them, and then there's always a part. Like these guys know, because there's always a few songs that we're just like, okay, that's all we got. Then we need that one other part to finish it up. There's always that one other part that takes effort, but a lot of them, the quote fun stuff of writing the song is it just comes out and it's easy.
Okay.
Then it's working the song out and getting the final touches on it and maybe adding that one outro part or the chorus part. That's the harder part. It's like getting that figured out, because you have to work. You have to like say, okay, I've got this part, now I got to find something that works with it.
You can hear more music from Poinsettia on their Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Poinsettia Music, or at Bandcamp at poinsettia.bandcamp.com. Vince, Matt, Finley, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you, George.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Malibu, Los Angeles, and Palm Springs.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 20,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.1 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with Kelly Policelli on guest research. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I will be back soon with another Love It or Hate It edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.